So we're continuing with chapter 26 in your world history book on the Cold War. We're going to go on to talk about the Cold War and how it began, onto the Soviet arms race, espionage and communist subversions, the atomic bomb spy cells, the descent of the Iron Curtain, and then the response of this, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade, the Berlin Wall, and on to Western Europe in the Cold War. So quite a few things we're going to cover in this part of the chapter. So we see when the Cold War, the dates of the Cold War, 1945, that's right after World War II, on to 1991. In 1991, we'll see something happened as the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is where the conflict was between mainly the United States and Russia and those other countries involved of the third world countries coming out of the war. So you can see where the Cold War began. You'll see, you'll see China and Russia and the aggression there, and on to the blue representing the free states at that time. And you'll see how Russia and China come in to control a lot of these countries. So we're going to be talking about this Cold War. The Cold War is not a war fought with military weapons, but with words, diplomacy, and ideology. So the free world was led by the United States, and then the communist bloc was dominated by the Soviet Union. And then we have those third world countries, which include many of the emerging nations in Africa, in Asia, and South America during the late 1940s and 1950s. Each side attempted to win allies through financial aid and assistance. And many nations fell to communism, and these nations were locked into an atheistic dictatorship that controlled every aspect of the people's lives and robbed them of freedoms. It's a pretty sad time when you see these shadow nations and nations of the world, third world nations, turning towards communist and socialism, first socialism onto communist leaders and dictators. And let's go on and find out. A sad time indeed. The Cold War begins. This was not a new conflict, but a new phase in the communist struggle for world domination. Lenin, remember Vladimir Lenin there? He dreamed of the day when communism would conquer Europe, Asia, and America. Of course, Lenin and Stalin, those Russian communist dictators, definitely wanted to rule the world with communism. In 1930, a communist professor in Moscow, he was a delegate to the United Nations. Remember we talked about the United Nations, and he gave his prediction. So his name was Dmitry Z. Manulsky. Manulsky right here. Here's a picture of him. What does he say? Now he's involved with the UN, and you can't believe that he'd be saying this, but let me quote it. He says, "War to the hilt is inevitable. Today we are strong enough to attack. Our time will come in 20 or 30 years. To win, we will need the element of surprise. The bourgeoisie will have to be asleep. So we shall begin by launching the most spectacular peace movement on record. There will be electrifying overtures and unheard of concessions. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will rejoice to cooperate in their own destruction. As soon as their guard is down, we will smash them with our clenched fists." So, of course, communism in that picture is the picture of a clenched fist, right? So here, he was in the United Nations, the same that came from the League of Nations, the same one formed for peace. Does that sound like a peaceful attitude? Let's go on. The Soviet aims, Soviet Russia, the Soviet socialists in Russia, I should say, and they were communist. Surrounding the Soviet Union were satellite nations. These nations were supposedly independent, but technically they were under the dominance of another, of communism, to be exploited for their economic military gain. So, to gain access to and build with a basis to have those warm waters of highways of commerce too. And also to carry on the old Russian policy of geographical expansion. Most important of all, to extend the ideologies of communism around the world. So the Soviets were aiming. What were they aiming for? They wanted to control these satellite nations and exploit them for their resources, especially those that were next to the water commerce, to be next to the water for their military strength, and then to again extend their ideology of communism to the whole world. The communist subversion and espionage. So the part of the Soviets' plan included an intense campaign of espionage against the West, especially America. So espionage, what does that mean? Spy. Subversion means to gradually bring in communism when the people don't even know that it's being brought in, right? A sneaky way. Communist agents infiltrated governments by working their way into influential positions to supply the Soviets with valuable information or to move the government towards accepting communism. Some of these things, a lot of communists were in Hollywood, a lot of agents in the government. And here we have, a lot of, even in normal affairs. There's a picture here, this nameless woman, I married a communist, so the Red Menace is real. And they were supposed to report this. So now we're going to have a lot of people thinking each other of being communist too. So, so this is what happens then. The Soviet espionage and the atomic bomb. Soviet spy. In 1949, the world was shocked when the Russians announced that they had successfully developed an atomic bomb. It had done so through the help of communist spies. The most notable were American communist spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Later, they were convicted of treason because they gave the secrets of the atomic bomb to Russia. And in 1951 and in 1953, they were convicted for passing vital information to the Russian agents. And they were executed in 1953. Also, Klaus Fuchs, director of the Britain's nuclear research, was convicted in 1950 for supplying Moscow with a top secret trigger mechanism to detonate the atomic bomb. So now Russia, now communist nations will have the atomic bomb as well as us, right? And so now we see Russia here. Actually, this picture here is in Siberia, I think, and they were testing their atomic bomb to make sure that it would work, just like we had done in New Mexico with the atomic bomb. So Truman says Russia set off an atomic blast in Russia, and it indeed did. Here's the newspaper. Rosenbergs were put to death for spying and giving information about the atomic bomb to Russia. And here we have a picture of this Russian bomb having 60 little bombs in it, it says. Spy or espionage spy cells in 1940 to 1950. Joseph P. McCarthy. Now remember, this is McCarthy, not General MacArthur that we'll be talking about in World War II. This is a guy named Joseph McCarthy. And he uncovered, well, as investigators were uncovering, several communist spy cells in the U.S. government. So Joseph McCarthy exposed much of the communist activity that was going on right in our government, in our state government, and also in the entertainment, the movie in Hollywood, and in the intellectual community, and even in the army. So he said there was a lot of backers to communists in America and these spy cells. Because of the great controversy by his accusations, McCarthy came under severe criticism and personal attack. Of course, they would attack and say, what? He's doing these witch hunts, and he's accusing people of being communism that aren't communism. And he would definitely be attacked. Although many of his conclusions were drawn from the accumulation of undisputed facts. Like there were a lot of spy cells in these areas of the government, entertainment, the intellectual or the colleges, and even in the army. The communists were trying to infiltrate into America in many ways. The descent of the Iron Curtain. So, what is the Iron Curtain? Well, the Iron Curtain shows us where the lines of communism, the communist countries, end and begin. So we'll see this here in the map. Stalin, of course, Joseph Stalin, who's that? He's the dictator of communist Russia. He continued to brutally oppress the Russian people after World War II. In fact, I think he murdered over 15 million onto starving to death people in the Ukraine and stuff. Probably up to 40 million people died under Stalin of the Russian people. He continued to increase Russia's industry and military production in the preparation he was preparing for a future war with the West. Stalin had promised the West after World War II that he would permit the peoples in occupied countries in which Russia occupied those countries to rebuild their lives on democratic and peaceful basis. Yeah, right. But the communists had no plans to relax their stranglehold on Eastern Europe. They would not let those people be free. The communist Soviet dominated puppet governments. That's where they'd set up their governments that really were communist governments. And he'd call these people's republics. And he would control these countries. The communists will control from Russia. In some of these countries, which I call shatter nations because they were shattered in war already, were Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. They would be controlled by the Russian Soviet Union and be put under puppet governments of communism. Sad day. Yugoslavia and Albania, they also established independent communist governments that maintained close ties to the Soviet Union. But they weren't puppet governments, but they were communist governments, both Yugoslavia and Albania. So here you have, this is the descent of the Iron Curtain. See, all these countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, over here towards Russia, they were all considered behind the Iron Curtain. They were considered communist holders, those countries. And then here we have the free enterprise on the other side, and we'll get into that too. This was called the Iron Curtain. The Soviet occupation zone, that was what was behind the Iron Curtain, where the Soviets occupied this area. The Soviet zone of East Germany became the communist-dominated German Democratic Republic in 1949. In all of the Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe, the communists killed or imprisoned multitudes of people that they considered a threat to their power and permitted no one to leave these communist countries. You couldn't just travel and leave. In 1946, Winston Churchill, of course, he was the Prime Minister of England. He spoke of an iron curtain of tyranny and oppression having descended upon the nations of Europe. So he basically said this iron curtain will have a hold of people and their freedom. And indeed it did. Here's some pictures of those countries under the Iron Curtain. And we're going to talk about East Germany, because Germany was divided between the communist half of Germany and the Western, which was the free enterprise. And we'll see the drastic comparison when Germany being divided. And this was in 1949, and you'll see. So when you think of the Iron Curtain, remember it was coined by, I should say, Winston Churchill. He gave that term of the Iron Curtain, representing those countries that were controlled by communism in Europe. The response of the West under the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, the British withdrew forces from Greece, leaving that nation and Turkey open to the Soviet conquests. So for centuries, Russians had been trying to gain control of the Dardanelles, which was that strait between Greece and Turkey, because they wanted to move into the Mediterranean Sea. So they wanted to have communism in those countries, Greece and Turkey especially. The Soviet expansion would threaten the old oil-rich Middle East. Of course, Soviet Russia wanted to get into the Middle East. Well, they're still trying to do that, trying to get into the Middle East with Israel and those Arab countries there, although Israel hadn't been formed yet at this time. In fact, Israel becomes a nation in 1948, really close to this time. So to prevent this from happening, President Truman of the United States announced a policy which he called containment. This is very important that you know this policy. The policy of containment in 1947 declared that the United States would aid any free nation to resist communist expansion. That if a free nation was resisting communists, the United States would come in and help them. So this policy was known as the Truman Doctrine, and it provided $400 million in economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey. Basically, Truman came in and said that the United States would help Greece and Turkey overcome communism, and we would so that began, we would contain communism in Russia. We would not let communism spread, right? That's the Truman Doctrine, is to contain the spread of communism. Pretty important there. Well, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan in 1947, United States Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a program in which the United States would lend money to provide massive economic assistance to rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. So basically what the Marshall Plan is in 1947 was to help these countries, these shattered nations, those that were not controlled by communism yet, to rebuild, including World War II had been devastating for all of Europe. So to help France, to help Great Britain, to help Spain, to help Italy, these countries, to help Germany even to rebuild. This recovery plan was known as the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is the rebuilding, and how the United States Secretary of State was Marshall, and we sent him to help these countries in Europe rebuild their economies and to rebuild their countries from what had happened during the war. This Marshall Plan extended credits amounting to $20 billion over the next 4 years in providing against further communist expansion in Europe. So the Marshall Plan went forth as the United States says, we're going to help these countries because otherwise Russia is going to come in. The Soviet Union, Russia, is going to come in and control them. And so we went on to help them. The areas of Germany, remember Germany was divided under American, British, and French occupations, were united in 1949 to form the Free Nation of West Germany. So right after the war, remember that the Germany was divided, and half of it was under Soviet Union, which is communism, and the other half, the western half, was occupied by American, British, and French that were going to help West Germany. And West Germany became a strong and prosperous country. Despite all the war that had gone on in Germany, West Germany now came out shining, and as the aid came in especially from America in the Marshall Plan. The Berlin blockade. You know what? I'm going to stop there because I'd like to really talk a lot about this. This is about what was happening in Berlin, and so we're running out of time here. So let's do that. Let's start the video here for our next video.